a fulfillment of Zephaniah 9:9, that a king would ride into Jerusalem on the colt, the foal of a donkey. And that's what Jesus is doing, as the people, the one time he allowed them to, are declaring, Hosanna to the King! Hosanna! Save now! So the triumphal entry happens the Sunday just before these events. There are cataloged events that Jesus does the first couple days of the week. Wednesday, it's silent. There's nothing recorded that Jesus did. But on Thursday now, we see a flurry of activity, culminating with Jesus meeting with his disciples in the upper room. They're celebrating the Passover meal. They've done it secretly. Remember, Jesus told two of his disciples, go, you see a man carrying a water pot, follow him, and when you get to his house, tell him the Lord has need for this. And so they had secretly provided a place for them to have the Passover meal. Why was that? Why did Jesus tell two of his disciples, don't tell anybody, just go and make preparation for the meal tonight so we can observe the Seder service, the Passover service? Why did he do that? Yeah, no, exactly right. The plot is thick, trying to catch him. And the Jewish leaders would not go to him in public when he's at the temple. They thought it'll cause a riot if we try to get him. But they were looking for a suitable moment to capture him. Well, that would have been a great place to do it. Just a few small people in that group, and he could have been taken, and hardly anybody would have been wiser. But they pulled it off. It was in secret. And so, but at that time, Jesus initiates the Lord's Supper too. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Broken body, shed blood, all of those things are part of what Jesus began to instruct them to do going forward with the Lord's Supper. All right. Now we come to that night. He's arrested. We don't have time to develop all of this, but there's so much there when Jesus is arrested in the garden. I believe at that point we know that he's already in agony as he's praying to the Lord, to his Father. He's sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. I believe Jesus was already in the process of sin bearing, even in the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not according to my will, but thy will be done. And Jesus submitted to the Lord, to God's plan, the plan that was all along. And Jesus knew it was time. All right, so he's arrested. He's taken to Annas, the former high priest, giving Caiaphas a chance to get together a quorum of the Sanhedrin. Then they take him to Caiaphas's house, and there's a group of these Jewish leaders that are going to condemn Jesus to death. It's all illegal. By Jewish law, they weren't supposed to do any of these things at night. That's why Matthew's gospel tells us that as soon as the sun came up, as soon as it was day, then they assembled again and condemned Jesus to death for blasphemy. But they had to take him to the civil authority. They had to have Pilate weigh in on this. They didn't have the right lawfully, according to Roman law, to execute Jesus. They had to get the civil authority. So they take him to Pilate. John chapter 18 says, and it was early. I mean, just after sunrise, just after they had hastily assembled that group to say, yes, he's guilty. He must die for blasphemy. Now they get Pilate. Pilate doesn't want to address the issue. I could go on and on about all of that. But ultimately he capitulates to the Jewish pressure. His job was on the line. For Pilate, it came down to a choice between his neck and his soul. There's something a little vague about the soul. There's nothing vague about the neck. And so Pilate said, okay, see to it. Remember, he washed his hands of the whole thing and said, see to it. You have permission. So that's why Jesus is dying that morning on a cross. He's being crucified. It's the Roman capital punishment. But all of those things, we have been enjoying a review of the sayings of Jesus from the cross, right? For weeks now, Pastor has been talking about each statement that Jesus made out of the 7 statements he made from the cross. But that's where we find him in this passage. He's on the cross. He's been there for 3 hours already. Starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, they have him crucified. But at noon, things start happening. And so that's what we're going to pick up with. And so just a couple thoughts, but I want us to make sure we put ourselves in the place of that group that was there watching that day. For example, here at the cross, Jesus was marked by the people for whom he died. They mocked him. They spat upon him, the continuance of that. But he was mocked by the people for whom he died, including us. Each one of these statements, I'm going to say, he does this for the people that are there at present, but it includes us. Because Jesus is dying not for his sins. He was perfect, yet without sin, right? But Jesus is dying for the sins of the whole world, including ours. All right, so in verse 33 of Mark 15, it says this, and when the 6th hour was come, that's noon. In the Jewish accounting for the day, the 3rd hour would be 9 o'clock, 3 hours after sunrise, basically. The 6th hour is noon. So when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by when they heard it said, behold, he crieth for Elijah. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed and gave it him to drink, saying, let alone, let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. Okay. Now Mark's gospel is a real fast-paced storytelling of Jesus' life. He leaves out some of the miracles that are in some of the other gospels, but Mark is moving pretty rapidly through the summation of Jesus' life. Doesn't start with anything related to his birth or any of those times. It's when he starts his earthly ministry, and Mark moves on through it until he gets here. When we get to the cross, Mark seems to slow down and give us some insights from his vantage point that were different than some of the other gospels. So what I want to remind you of is a couple of miraculous things that happen while Jesus is on the cross. Again, keep in mind, some of the things he says from the cross are some of the things that impacted the people who were watching. Suddenly it becomes dark. Now, there have tried to be physical explanations of this. What are some of the things the critics or skeptics might say cause this darkness? What? An eclipse? Yeah. But that cannot happen because the Passover, when it happens for the Jewish lunar calendar, a Passover event, the week of Passover, is a week of a full moon. When you have a full moon, you can't have an eclipse because the moon is not going to be visible during the day where the sun would block it, or where the moon would block it. It's on the other side as the planets. So a full moon would not allow for a solar eclipse, not even possible. And this isn't a solar eclipse. We all remember just a few years ago, we were kind of in the cone of the path of the full eclipse. And, we all remember it getting kind of gray, and it was eerie. Were you guys in Arkansas at the time? That was a full eclipse at that level, wasn't it? But it didn't get dark like an evening, did it? It was, okay, thank you. I'm glad you were in Arkansas and validated that. This is not an event like an eclipse. Not possible. Anybody hear another explanation of why it got dark? Yes. Maybe it was a violent dust storm that just happened to blow in, but there's absolutely nothing to suggest anybody's pointing that out as a reason. But because of the idea, a dark cloud came, and for 3 hours, all of us saw the lightning, heard the rumbling the last couple mornings. But storms usually don't just park on top of some place for 3 hours, and if possible. But that's not what this is. This is not a storm. Some of you have watched movies of Jesus when he's crucified, and have you watched it rain? Ben-Hur, some of those movies about the Passion of Christ where it's raining while Jesus is on the cross. It's not raining. It never says anything about rain. But that's the inference that this was a dark thundercloud. And no, this is nothing less than a supernatural darkening. And I think it was probably limited to right there at Jerusalem. I don't know how widespread it was. But this was a darkness that could be felt. That's the inference. It was dark. It was eerie. It was unnatural. Because I believe it was supernatural. Anybody remember what the 10th plague is in Egypt? It was darkness over the whole land. But it scared the people. And in the same thing, the 9th plague, I said maybe the 10th plague. The 9th plague, just before the death angel, it was dark. That is an indication in other places in the Bible of judgment. All right? I think that's exactly what's going on here. The supernatural darkness that engulfed those people. They have been standing there for 3 hours. They've been mocking Jesus while he's on the cross. They've been spitting on him. They've been saying, if he really is the Messiah, that's what it says in the verses just before we read. If you really are the king, come down. Come off the cross. We'll believe you. And of course, that was not part of the plan for Christ to stop short of paying the full price for the sin debt. But this darkness had to have been eerie for those people. This is unnatural. Had to have given them pause. And many of them probably did view that as, what is this? Maybe a precursor to judgment? Well, they're in the process of trying to kill the God of the universe in human form, right? Okay, so when we get to, it says there in verse 33, it's dark over the whole land until the 9th hour. So if 6th hour is noon, what's the 9th hour? 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when Jesus is going to die. All right, he's been on the cross from 9 o'clock in the morning. He will die, as we'll see, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Verse 34, though, it talks about just prior to his death. Now, last week, as a matter of fact, Pastor dealt with 2 statements that Jesus said from the cross. One of them was tetelestai. John chapter 19, verse 30, it is finished, right? So that's one of the things Jesus says. And I agree with Pastor. It wasn't as if he's expiring at the moment where he said, I don't think that. I think it was like this cry near the end. But you need to understand, what do people die of primarily in the process of Roman crucifixion? What do they end up usually dying from? Yeah, asphyxiation. They get lower and lower and less in their breathing until they can no longer lift themselves up to breathe, and they smother to death, basically, asphyxiation. But in these last sayings of Jesus, the Bible makes it clear that he says it with a loud, strong voice. All right? What was the other one besides it is finished? What was the other thing that Jesus said right at the end? No, that's at the very beginning. When he said, Father, forgive them. That's the first thing he says from the cross. Yes, good. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Right? What do both of those statements, what do those point out? Why did Jesus say, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit? It is finished. What does that point out? Say it. He was in control. Jesus was no victim. He's the victor. And these statements are statements of victory. But he says them with great power, authority, dynamism just before he yields his spirit. And in both these cases, he does that. He is in control of even when he dies. But what we read here in verse 34 is a powerful thing. And it says, he says it with a loud voice, right? So even though most people in crucifixion would be in decline and able to speak less and less, Jesus says these last three statements with great power, expressing authority. But this one is one of those amazing statements from the cross that really shows how profound this moment is in history. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That particular phrase is Aramaic, but it would have been known by all that heard it. This is a direct quote from Psalm 22 and verse 1. The other Gospels tell us when he says this, what does it mean? How's it translated? This Gospel translates it too. What's it say? Yeah, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now that's a direct quote from the Messianic Psalm of Psalm 22, starting in verse 1. And there is clearly some context to this, that is, this would be the only instant in the history of all eternity, eternity past, eternity future. This would be the only moment when the Father and the Son experience separation, as if the Father had turned away from his Son. He could not behold the sin that Jesus had become while carrying the sins of the whole world, including us. So, again, there's way too much to unpack here. What I want you to know, in fulfillment of biblical prophecy, Jesus said this, but he also said it with the agonizing experience that he knew there was a moment of separation between his Father and himself, because his Father could not behold sin. And the wrath of God was being poured out upon sin in the person of his Son, Jesus. But the fact that he said, Eloi, Eloi, that caused some of the people around, the Jewish hearers, the Romans wouldn't have understood any of this, but they said, oh, what did he say? Elijah? Elias? They thought he was calling for Elijah, right? That's what the next part of the verse tells us. Oh, don't interrupt him. You know, they were going to give him some vinegar. He had said, I thirst. And they were going to give him some vinegar at the end. And the people around said, no, wait. Let's see. Let's see if Elijah shows up. Now, that's why I'm saying this was a Jewish impression. Because the Jews, the Jewish leaders in particular, they viewed Elijah as one of the greatest of the prophets. But he was a prophet who was going to come prior to Messiah. And they asked John the Baptist, right? Are you Elijah? No, I'm just a voice crying in the wilderness. Because they had the preconception that Elijah, he was going to resurrect and be the one that pronounced the Messiah was coming. Okay? So that's what's going on here. And some of these people want to say, hey, leave him alone. Don't give him anything. Let's see if Elijah shows up. Well, of course, he was specifically talking about that the Father could not behold in love his own Son because Jesus was bearing the sins of the world. Okay. We've got to just continue. But the next couple verses, the idea of even those people who killed Jesus, he still loved them. And those who sinned against him, he still loved them, including us, as he's dying. So verse 37 says this. And again, Jesus cried with a loud voice. This probably would have been the John 19:30. It is finished. One word in the Greek, tetelestai. The whole idea is encapsulated. Everything is accomplished. Everything he had to do on the cross is done. Now it is finished. And he gave up the ghost. John 19:30 says, and he pillowed his head and surrendered his spirit. I mean, it's a powerful thought that Jesus was in control right to the end. Okay, I'm not gonna deal with that anymore, except to say, you know, Jesus died. There's no question of his death. The swoon theory and the idea that after he was taken down off the cross, he revived, and that's why they saw him later. He had resurrected. Not that he had resurrected, but that he had come back to life somehow. These were executioners. These people knew when they saw death. In fact, that's what the next verses say, right? Verse 39. And when the centurion which stood over against him saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. This man, this centurion, a Roman over 100 different soldiers in his command, today this was his task. He was an expert in death. He was the one who supervised crucifixions. And they were expert at their craft. They knew when someone was dead. But of course, the other Gospels even confirm there's no way Jesus might have survived in some kind of a swoon. Because what did one of the soldiers do from the ground when Jesus is still hanging on the cross? Took a spear and jammed it right up into his heart. And it says, and the blood and the water rushed out. That means the heart had already stopped pumping. The red blood cells had separated from the plasma. It comes out as red and white. The water, the blood. He was dead. There was everything in the story confirms death. His friends are going to now anoint his body hastily. They have to get him in the tomb. It's a high holy Sabbath that is about to come. Many of them were preparing to take the Passover meal that night. They broke the legs of the other two thieves, right, to hasten their death. They had to get these guys off the cross before dark, before sunset, the high holy Sabbath. So Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, according to John 19, they come, they anoint his body hastily with 100 pounds of sweet-smelling ointments, myrrh, aloe. But they hastened to put him into the newly hewn tomb of Joseph. Nobody had ever been in there. Joseph of Arimathea donated the tomb for Jesus. But he was dead. Those people who loved him and would have loved to see some sign of animation that he was still alive, they knew he was dead. But because they had hastily anointed him and put his body in the tomb, closed it up with the stone, there were the women who still wanted to do more. They wanted to anoint his body even further, to retard the decaying process and to try to cover up the smell of decay. So over the Passover, the Sabbath, the high holy Sabbath, the Passover, from Friday evening, Saturday evening, they're sequestered away in the upper room. The disciples who had fled away from Jesus, they were all wondering what's going to happen next. We are probably next. But the women loved Jesus so much that they had made more ointment. They had made more special spices in preparation for additional anointing of his body. That's why as we read into chapter 16, they're going to go early in the morning, just as the sun is coming up. Notice what it says, talking about the resurrection. Verse 1 of chapter 16. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, this would be James the Less, one of the apostles, the mother of James and Joseph. That's this mother, Mary here, and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him further. And early in the morning, the first day of the week, Sunday, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. I think that should be spelled S-O-N. At the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, who will roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? Now, the area we believe was the home of John Mark and his mother Mary. They're in the northern part of what would have been the city of Jerusalem. I'm sorry, the southern part, if that's where the house is that's been identified with the house of the upper room, that area. So they would have had to walk through the old city of Jerusalem and exit out the Damascus gate on the north side of the city to where Calvary would have been. By the way, let me remind you, the imagery of this is so powerful. Calvary is what the Romans called it. It meant skull. What was the Hebrew word for skull? Golgotha. Yeah. So both the Hebrews, the Jewish people, and the Romans called this the skull hill. But it's Mount Calvary, right? Golgotha. But the biblical name for this hill in Jerusalem is Moriah. What happened on Mount Moriah? Exactly. This is the very place in Genesis chapter 22 where God said to Abraham, Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and take him to the mountains of Moriah, to a place I will show you, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. God had never asked for a human sacrifice. This was beyond anything Abraham believed about God. But in obedience, he took Isaac, right? They go to Mount Moriah. And of course, God stops him. God knew what Abraham was going to do. This was not a test for God to see whether Abraham would offer Isaac or not. The test was for Abraham to know he would offer Isaac if necessary. And Abraham had concluded, according to Romans chapter 4, Abraham had concluded, if I kill him, it's up to God. He's going to have to raise him up because he promised me this son. But what the imagery of take your son, your only son, and he was going to die on Mount Moriah. That's exactly where Jesus is crucified. So they come that early morning, and on the way to the tomb, the women are talking about, how are we going to move that big stone? They had seen exactly where he had been buried. They knew the tomb. They also saw that a big stone had been rolled in front of it. And their debate was, how are we going to move that? Well, when they get there, to their surprise, the stone's already rolled back. Nobody else is around. By the way, they had no idea. These women had no idea what had happened on the Sabbath day. That the Jewish leaders had gone to Pilate and said, listen, we heard that deceiver, he said that on the third day he was going to rise again. You need to make sure that doesn't happen. You need to put some guards up there, and you need to seal that stone. And all that had taken place on the Sabbath, right? Pilate said, go make it as sure as you can. So there are Roman guards set up there. But when this stone is rolled back, when this earthquake happens, when the angel shows up, these Roman guards, it says they fall like dead men in John chapter 20. Now they get up, and it says they go into the city, Matthew 27, 28. They go into the city, and they report to the chief priests what's happened up there at the tomb, and that his body is gone. Remember, they pay a large sum of money to bribe him and say, you tell anybody that asks that his disciples came and stole his body while we were sleeping. And if it comes to the ears of the governors, don't worry, we'll secure you. We'll make sure everything's okay. Truth of the matter is, though, they're all gone. When the women get there, the stone is rolled back, and they go in and they see this angel. And notice what it says in 16 and verse 4. And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting in the right side, clothed in a long white garment. And they were affrighted. Okay? They're afraid. And it's clear when you see somebody wearing these kind of clothes in an empty tomb, it's an angel. And he said to them, be not afraid, be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall you see him, as he said unto you. Okay. So here's this angelic being, this messenger who says, he's not here. The other Gospels expand it and say, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen, just like he said. How many times have we looked at in the Gospels where Jesus is telling them, they're going to take me with wicked hands, they're going to crucify me, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. Right over their heads. They didn't even hear it, right? And time after time, they were not anticipating resurrection. I just told you that even the enemies of Jesus said, hey, he said on the third day he was going to rise again. You need to make that sepulcher sure. But his own disciples who had heard it repeatedly missed it. They weren't anticipating this. All right. The point is this, folks. Jesus bore our sins upon the cross at that moment when God had to turn away from his only beloved Son because he was carrying the sins of the world. But because Jesus died, he paid the penalty. He paid the cost of sin for everybody that would receive his free gift of salvation. Beyond that, the most important thing, and to me, I know what I'm about to say may sound controversial. I don't think it is, but Jesus dying on the cross, shedding his blood, paying the price for the sin, making the redemption possible. But one of the most important ingredients to our salvation is the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. It is absolutely essential. If Jesus did not rise in bodily form from the dead, he's no different than any other religious leader who had died and was buried. But God stamped his validation of approval on the cross and what happened at the tomb when Jesus rose again. He was in complete control. As Dan said, at his death, he yielded his spirit when the time came. And in resurrection power, Jesus came forth. Up from the grave he arose with a mighty triumph o'er his foes. He arose a victor from the dark domain, and he lives forever with his saints to reign. The resurrection is the most important part of the validation of our salvation, folks. Romans 10 says this way, "But if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved." The resurrection is absolutely an essential part of the process of salvation, and it's nothing we can do to pay for it ourselves. Our sins stacked up in that sin cart, but Jesus paid it, and there's nothing we can do to pay for it. All we need to do is accept the free gift of salvation, and that's why we celebrate Easter every year in a special way, the resurrection. All right, I'm sorry I've rambled on and on. We need to go, though, because church is going to happen in a few minutes. God bless. Great to see you. Bill, Sue, thank you. You're always welcome. Even if Benny doesn't come, you're welcome. And Paula, so good to see you. God bless you. Great to see you all. Thank you. Appreciate that.